Hello, everyone, and welcome to Psyched Out, a podcast focused on all things psychology, like psychological thrillers, unethical experiments, true crime cults, and more. I am your host, Emily, and for those who don't know, I have a bachelor's degree in forensic psychology and a background in law enforcement. This helps me provide unique insight on some of the world's most famous cases, movies, and events. In today's episode, we'll be talking about Aang. That's right, today's episode is centered on our favorite airbending avatar. I recently had the privilege of seeing the latest Avatar Aang movie and saw how many fans just honestly didn't grasp Aang's character within the film. And I wanted to shed some light on just how accurately he's portrayed for someone with his history and trauma. If you're on the YouTube side of things, you may have noticed my large Avatar Last Airbender collection in the background. This show and franchise is something that I have loved for a very long time, and it's something that I have been super passionate about for a very long time, to the point where I have my own little Avatar Last Airbender hat collection. So I got this blue one to match my blue shirt. I have this other Appa hat. I've got an Appa beanie. And I have another Appa beanie. I have a plethora of Avatar Last Airbender shirts. I love the show wholeheartedly. So I was very excited to do this episode. The depths of the characters is just truly amazing, like peak storytelling. And I'm just really, really excited to weigh in on this film, as well as Aang as a whole. But before we do that, I do need to do some housekeeping, so just bear with me here. First and foremost, I do want to apologize for forgetting to upload the episode for last week. I had everything prepped and ready to upload, and I just completely spaced it while I was preparing for vacation. You guys have been very kind and generous, understanding, and patient, and I just really, really want you to know that I appreciate it. It means a lot. That said, the history of asylums is still on the docket, so don't worry about that. You will still be getting that episode. But we also have some other things that I wanted to go over very briefly. First and foremost, I will be doing an episode on the Pillowcase Murders, which is a documentary on Paramount Plus, if you guys want to go watch that. Along with some other things. I've got some other side projects, but we will also be doing an installment of Justice on the I-45 coming up as well. So stay tuned for all of that. And if you guys want more content like this, feel free to suggest another Avatar The Last Airbender or Legend of Korra character down in the comments that you would like for me to analyze. Now, without further ado, we are going to go ahead and jump on in. So the largest part of Aang's character is that he is the last airbender. I mean, that's like what the entire franchise is based on, so I shouldn't have to say that, but I do. That being said, existing as the last of your people isn't easy, especially with the way the airbenders were wiped out. We have to remember that a 12-year-old Aang is going to handle and process trauma very differently than a 25-year-old Aang, which is something I think this fandom has really struggled with being part of the audience for the latest film. Aang's perceptions are going to grow and change as he gets older. And what the latest film does is really highlight Aang's struggle to grapple with his survivor's guilt. Something that I think a lot of people understand at face value, but don't really know the complicated nuances of. So what I wanted to do is really break down Aang's survivor's guilt and how that's represented in his character. In case you don't know what survivor's guilt is, this is a very simple definition that I was able to find. So survivor's guilt is the experience of psychological distress due to surviving or escaping a situation relatively unharmed or unaffected as compared to others. It's important to note that survivor's guilt is not a mental health disorder, but a recognized condition that often requires treatment. It is something that can very, very, very clearly get way, way, way worse with time, so keep that in mind. Obviously, Aang is the only one of the air nomads to have survived the Fire Nation's attack, in part because he ran away, and this is a huge factor for his guilt, which the new film very clearly discusses. Major factors of survivor's guilt are that it's often comorbid with PTSD and manifests in a lot of complex behavioral traits. For instance, someone with survivor's guilt may go out of their way to be a hero, to try and fix things for other people, to help make up for their perceived failures. They'll essentially kill themselves to help other people. This, though, is different from just being a people pleaser. This can often result in people placing themselves in dangerous situations to assist others rather than just your stereotypical people pleasing. Alternatively, people with survivor's guilt can also withdraw from their communities or those they perceive may need their help, consequently severing ties with their social circles because of their perceived failures. I would say that we can see both of these responses in Aang. Throughout the latest film, Aang places himself in increasingly perilous situations, all to help Tagah. He throws caution to the wind and is even willing to look past a lot of red flags, like a lot of red flags, just to be of assistance. He literally dies in the film trying to help Tagah and to restore his own people. This very clearly stems from his own guilt at his perceived failures. At the same time, Aang does not listen to his friends and the reservations about getting Sonam's staff. Um, he really goes out of his way to avoid the advice that they are giving to him. He really rejects his already established community, including Katara, and her warnings about the danger of their situation, all because Aang is striving to make up for his transgressions. As the audience, we know that Aang really isn't responsible for the genocide of the air nomads. At 12 years old, with no other training besides airbending, he he realistically would have died along with everybody else at the air temple. And we can understand that from an outside perspective. But it's important to note that those with survivor's guilt don't interpret the series of events from a logical lens. It could be an earthquake or a mass shooting, something entirely out of their control, but due to the event itself, the inability to truly process that type of trauma and decimation, the brain actually tries to make sense of it in a different way. And the brain does that by applying self blame to really make sense of what happened. For example, it's much easier for the brain to say, well, if I just did X, then Y and Z wouldn't have happened, compared to, this really crazy natural event just killed hundreds of people, and I don't know how to quantify or conceptualize this. So, self blame and self guilt is often the way that we interpret really, really traumatic events, especially when it comes to survivor's guilt. Additionally, common symptoms of survivor's guilt are numbness, disconnection, shame, sadness, headaches, trouble sleeping, and social disconnection. We see plenty of these in Aang. There's very clearly a deep seated sadness. He very clearly has trouble sleeping, hence the nightmares. And he has a lot of shame surrounding what happened to his people. And all of these feelings help influence his decisions throughout the film, which at face value seem out of character for him because a lot of the audience can't comprehend that 12-year-old Aang is different from 25-year-old Aang. We are not dealing with a 12-year-old child anymore. 12-year-old Aang didn't have time to process his grief and trauma because he was fighting a massive war. With the war being over, Aang legitimately has nothing but time to sit with his grief and shame and conceptualize and reprocess the massive genocide against his people, which makes his actions in the film that much more accurate. They're not out of character in the slightest. They're completely and totally in character for somebody in his position with his trauma. It's important to note as well that different people react to trauma in different ways. Survivor's guilt can be characterized as dispositional and enduring, or context dependent and relatively temporary. It may be that you can live a relatively normal life with survival's guilt, but anytime a natural disaster happens, your feelings of shame and failure resurface. Or in Aang's case, it can be persistent regardless of circumstance and regardless of time. As for the history of survivor's guilt, it actually began as a recognized symptom of PTSD in both the 3rd edition and 4th edition of the DSM. It was later removed in the DSM 5, and this was in part because it does not manifest solely from PTSD. However, the link between the two remains incredibly strong, which is something that is very accurate for Aang's character, which is something that we'll get into a little bit later, but we'll talk about it briefly now. So, Aang's nightmares and visualizations of the genocide are reflective of both survivor's guilt and PTSD. Some argue that he wasn't even present for when the Fire Nation attacked, so there's not really a reason for him to have any trauma-related symptoms for it, but that's just a really closed-minded opinion and perception. Because at 12 years old, Aang saw Gyatso's skeleton, and Gyatso was very clearly a father figure to Aang. It was somebody that he loved dearly. Aang also saw his home burned, empty, and razed to the ground. It's not hard for the brain, even at 12 years old, to extrapolate what actually happened. In fact, it's just as damaging to stay awake at night wondering and visualizing all the horrible ways people likely died due to the Fire Nation. It makes sense. He didn't have to physically be there. He still had a lot of traumatizing experiences in and of itself. As for additional psychoanalytics of survivor's guilt, studies indicate that there are several risk factors for survivor's guilt. One of the most prominent ones being closeness to the deceased or witnessing suffering of the decedent. Aang is so deeply invested in his culture well before he ever ran away, because at the end of the day, that's just how the air nomads are. They have a much stronger cultural connection than, say, the Fire Nation or the Earth Kingdom. So not only was Aang experiencing survivor's guilt for the people he knew and loved, like Gyatso, who got obliterated by the Fire Nation, he was also experiencing grief and guilt for losing his culture as well. To lose something like that is not something that many people can relate to. Frankly, I don't have a deeply embedded culture. I'm just some random white lady in the US. So I'm not going to understand what that's like. But there are plenty of people who do. Indigenous individuals, people who have very close ties to Africa. The slave trade had a big impact on culture for a lot of Black Americans. On top of that, feelings of survivor's guilt, surprisingly, are more likely to develop in people who fear social interaction, confrontation, or rejection. And the key word there is confrontation. Aang at his core is a non-confrontational individual, which is partially his personality, but also partially the culture that was embedded in him. And what's ironic here is that his guilt stems from not doing enough to protect his home, which would inherently require confrontation on his part. He would have to have been there, and he would have had to have had a willingness to kill, which Aang doesn't have. So it's entirely a catch-22. At the end of the day, as far as Aang is concerned, legitimately, no one knows how he feels or has experienced the type of loss that he has. The closest comparison that we have would be Katara. So when Aang learns that Tagah has almost an identical history to him, Aang feels like he finally has somebody in his life who just gets it. He doesn't have to explain. This individual just understands. So Aang is naturally going to be drawn to that. He's going to be drawn to Tagah. Tagah is basically a support group for Aang. It's not that different than when family members of murder victims or kidnappings or natural disasters find support in one another, because at the end of the day, the average individual is not going to understand what that feels like or what that situation is. So Aang being drawn to Tagah makes a lot of sense. Like it's completely and totally on brand for his character. Then we get into some other manifestations of survivor's guilt. So survivor's guilt also manifests in flashbacks, irritability, social isolation, and nightmares. Symptoms, like I said, that we've seen in Aang, but also symptoms that are reminiscent of PTSD. And these are also symptoms that we see in Tagah. Tagah is increasingly irritable. He clearly has his own flashbacks and trauma, and like Aang, he's trying to overcompensate for his perceived failures. However, he takes a much more confrontational route. In reality, Aang and Tagah are two sides of the same coin, which was very intentional. And if Aang were any different, he would become Tagah. He would have gone over to that side, except it's Aang, so he's not going to. To make matters worse, survivor's guilt is more probable when there has been a significant number of fatalities. The higher death toll creates and intensifies a sense of inequity, which is a core theory in why survivor's guilt develops. In Aang's case, the death toll is unimaginably high, arguably astronomical. And this sense of inequity is really important for a character like Aang, because not only is it like not fair, it goes a step beyond that. Because the air nomads and the Avatar are centered on keeping peace and balance. With Aang being the only airbender left, there is inherently no true balance in the world. There is no equity. So it's not just at a surface level, it goes down to the very roots of who he is as an individual. And that deepens and worsens the inequity that he was going to feel anyways with survivor's guilt. It compounds one another. We also have to look at this from a more intimate standpoint, beyond just Aang as a whole. Because if you've watched Legend of Korra, you know that Aang and Katara get married, and it's super cute, and they have 3 kids. And there's Bumi, who's the oldest, but he's a non-bender until he eventually gets airbending from the spirit world. Then you have Kaya, the daughter, who is the second oldest, and she's a waterbender. And you have the youngest son, Tenzin, who is an airbender. In theory, when we look at this inequity, right? Even after they get married, even after they have kids, there was always a chance that Aang and Katara would never have a child with airbending, meaning that there was always a chance that Aang would legitimately be the last airbender to ever exist. And personally, I can't imagine the sense of guilt and complexity of his emotions when it came to having kids or discussing having kids. Granted, that is a topic for another time, but like there's extra layers and levels there when it comes to the sense of inequity and the survivor's guilt and just all of it as a whole. It's so messy, it's so complicated, but it's so real and authentic. Now, the last and most concerning factor of survivor's guilt is that it's tied directly to higher levels of suicidality, which again, I think manifests in Aang's character. His willingness to push the limits at all costs. The way he was so careless in the latest film, case in point, like he literally died. And while I don't think Aang was actively trying to get himself killed, I do think he didn't really have the reservations he did as a kid or if Tagah wasn't around. And it sounds counterintuitive when you think about it because it is. Like, if you're terrified of being the last airbender ever, why put yourself in a position to die? Quite frankly, these aren't normal circumstances, and Aang was willing to die because it meant that there was a chance his culture got revived. I think things could have been different or would have been different if Tagah wasn't around. And we have to understand that Aang didn't know Tagah was the bad guy. So as long as Tagah was able to live, even if Aang died, Tagah could reinstate the air nomads, and Aang's sacrifice would have been worth it. And in a way, he would have made amends for his perceived failure. He would have solved the inequity. Now, putting all of that aside, let's hone in a little bit more on the PTSD side of things, because I do think it's important, and why PTSD does tie into Aang's character. First and foremost, much of what we have already discussed at this point overlaps with PTSD, but there are a few additional issues. For instance, difficulty parenting, familial discord, and then a lot of stress on interpersonal relationships. These are explored more deeply in The Legend of Korra when it comes to Bumi and Kaya, because we learned that they didn't have as much of an idealistic childhood as Tenzin did. And we see it as well in the way Aang pushes his friends into a dangerous situation with the immortal storm. Aang admittedly refers to his friends as his family, and yet he comes into consistent conflict with them throughout the film due to previously mentioned factors. Like he is striving for this goal at all costs because he thinks that it's going to fix all of the guilt and shame that he has. Now, one thing that I see a lot of fans lamenting about is that, oh, well, Aang wouldn't do that. And as I mentioned, Aang is very different as an adult than he was as a kid. And part of that is due to the trauma, guilt, and PTSD, because PTSD fundamentally alters brain chemistry, leading to small or large personality changes. Aang was never going to be a carbon copy of his 12-year-old self. And given everything that happened, that would realistically be biologically impossible. Just as the others aren't carbon copies of their childhood selves either. Sure, there's a lot of similarities. There are a lot of core aspects of their personality that are presented to us as adults. But there's tiny differences too. Like in The Legend of Korra, right? We see Sokka as a councilman. Sokka is much more serious. He's much more reserved. He has done a lot of growing up. Same with Zuko. Zuko is very different now compared to how he started the original series. People are going to grow and people are going to change. Lastly, what I want to talk about is why Aang didn't seem to notice or care about Taga's transgressions earlier in the film. For instance, when Tagah almost killed the Denied when they're going into the Immortal Storm, he starts to crush their, like, an air blimp. I don't know specifically what to call it, airship, I guess. And if you've been around the channel for a while, this is going to sound familiar to you because we talk a lot about it, and that is cognitive dissonance. But I think this is almost a special case of cognitive dissonance where it's not necessarily Aang's fault, because Aang perceives Tagah as being an airbender from Aang's own time. Aang's experience with airbending and the air nomad culture is very different from Tagah's. To Aang, airbenders aren't warriors, they are incredibly pacifistic in nature. There would be no reason for them to hone their airbending skills to kill somebody. And airbenders are supposed to be understanding and gentle in spirit. Aang is going to assume that the same is for Tagah because why wouldn't he? That's all Aang knows. What we have to remember is that by the time we meet Aang, the air nomads have gone through 2 separate genocides, first with the Earth Kingdom, then with the Fire Nation. The amount of information and cultural practices that were lost between Tagah's time and Aang's time is, quite frankly, insurmountable, meaning that Aang was never going to know or understand the warrior mentality that Tagah had. Why? Because when was he ever told that the air nomads had to become warriors to help stop the Earth Kingdom's massacre? When was he ever presented with a time where the air nomads had to go to war? Like, it didn't happen. He didn't know. That information was completely and totally lost to time. And quite frankly, the responsibility of that falls to Avatar Sonam. That is on her. And so you can't really blame Aang for what I can't even call it naivety because he legitimately just didn't know. He had no idea. So when Aang starts to see the warning signs in Tagah, it's supernatural for him to either excuse them or look past them because he has no other narrative to reconcile that information with. No other interpretations of airbender culture besides the one that he knows. So we have to give him a little bit of grace. Like, he only knows what he was born and raised into. It's not like there's other airbenders that are out there that can give him conflicting narratives on what air nomad culture is actually like. There's nothing else for him to be exposed to. And then we also compound this with the fact that he wants to believe the good in Tagah because Tagah is the only connection that he has left to his culture. So yes, Aang didn't call Tagah out for his actions. Yes, Aang didn't acknowledge the red flags, but it makes sense. Like, all of this makes so much sense in the film. And I want to give people the benefit of the doubt. I don't want to say that the fans are dense or that they're not paying enough attention, but I do think people were very, very quick to start pointing the finger at Aang for these, quote, out of character reactions or interactions. And at face value, I could see why people think that. But when you look at it at a deeper level and you really get into why Aang would be doing what he's doing, like, it makes so much sense. It makes so much sense. So, in conclusion, were there aspects of the film that I think could have been done better, just in general? Yes. I think everybody but Katara got nerfed to make Tagah scarier. However, none of these people have ever fought an airbender before that's actually trying to kill them. Because sure, they've probably sparred Aang, but it's not like Aang's like, oh, let me just murder my family and my friends. Like, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And also, all Zuko, Toph, Sokka, and Katara know about airbending culture and air nomads is, one, what they've been told by, their relatives, or in Zuko's case, like Fire Nation propaganda, and Aang. So they also don't know that Tagah is this deadly warrior. They have no way of knowing that. Do I think that there were aspects of the film where, like, Toph could have done better fighting the Denied because all she had to do was go underground and start metal bending their weapons? Yeah, absolutely. I think things could have been done differently, but I also kind of understand why it was done the way that it was. I think the animation was gorgeous. That is probably some of the best 2D animation I have ever seen. So shout out to all of the artists, everybody that worked on that film. Congratulations, you guys did amazing. I do want to say, though, that I was very, very impressed on a psychoanalytical level how much they nailed it. How much that all of this just made so much sense. Because Aang wasn't out of character. He was in character for the trauma he experienced as a child. And while his decisions may have seemed out of character to the audience, when you look at it from a psychoanalytical level, it makes sense. The dots connect. And it was just fantastic to see. And at the end of the day, he still kept a lot of his love and a lot of his whimsy. But I really do think that it added more depth to his character, and it also kind of explains some of the behaviors that he has in the Legend of Korra when it comes to like his family, like Kaya and Bumi, and the different relationships he had with them compared to Tenzin, and the complexities of that, and why Tenzin doesn't understand that, oh, I was the favorite child. Like, people have been saying for so long, oh, Aang not being a good dad was out of character, but there's layers to that as well, because what is a father? Aang didn't have a father. The closest thing he had to a father was Gyatso. Like, there's just so much to talk about. I don't think I have enough time. It's just, it's beautiful and it's gorgeous, and I think the team did really well. I am sad that it was not a theatrical release because I would have loved that shit, and I would have loved like an Appa popcorn bucket. That shit would have been baller as hell, and it would have gone on my shelf back there. But I digress. In the end, I hope that you guys learned something new. And I would absolutely love to know your thoughts on the film and franchise. Like, legitimately, I have nobody else to talk to about it right now. So please, if you guys want to just yap about it in the comments, by all means, go ahead. As I said earlier, if you have a character that you want me to analyze, let me know in the comments as well. I really love and adore this series, this universe, so much, and I am more than willing to make additional content like this as we go. Obviously, it's not going to be every week or every other week, but I do think it would be fun to sit down and have a couple of episodes where we talk about Katara or Sokka or Zuko or Toph or Azula. Like, I'm game for anybody, even Legend of Korra. We could talk about Korra, we could talk about Asami. It's just, there's a lot of potential here, and it's something that I'm super passionate about. And I think, honestly, it's a bit of a palate cleanser for some of the other stuff that we talk about with all the murder and crazy things like cannibalism and child grooming and all that jazz. So, thank you guys. I appreciate it. I know this is a bit of a shorter episode, but I was just so excited I couldn't wait. If you guys like this, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, please take care of each other. Stay safe out there. And as always, stay psyched out.